Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Midas Touch Network to Legal AF. I'm Lisa Graves with Court Accountability Action. And today I am so excited to have on our show Senator Russ Feingold, who I had the joy of working alongside as a Senate staffer when I was working for Senator Leahy as his chief nominations counsel. That was also the period in which Senator Feingold was working to push forward the McCain-Feingold campaign finance reforms, which are known as the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, BICRA. A really important piece of legislation, I think one of the most important pieces of anti-corruption legislation in the history of the United States. And that legislation stood and was in effect for almost a decade until the United States Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Roberts struck it down in a 5-4 decision. And here we are this year in 2025 with the 15th anniversary of that really ignominious decision. And so we're really honored to have Senator Feingold on to talk about how that law came to be, his work with the late, great Senator McCain, and what he's thinking about how we can respond to the crisis that has unfolded as a result of this terrible decision by the Roberts Court that has unleashed these billionaires to really try to dominate our elections at the presidential level and all the way through the states, including recently the effort of Elon Musk to try to capture the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which the Wisconsin residents, the citizens of Wisconsin rejected. So Senator Feingold, it's just an honor and a joy to have the chance to be here with you. Welcome to the show.
Lisa, thank you. I'm a great admirer of yours. We've been friends for a very long time and all the different iterations of our careers, but I'm a huge fan of yours and your work, and I even got my haircut for the occasion.
Well, it looks fantastic, and that's so nice of you.
Yes.
And I know we want to talk seniority, but I have to say that period during the first George W. Bush administration, when I had the chance to observe you close up on the Senate Judiciary Committee, to see your excellent questions at Senate hearings, to hear your eloquent, succinct, just heartfelt statements, both in the Senate Judiciary Committee and the floor. It's one of the great honors of my life to have been able to work alongside you as a staffer on that committee, Senator. So thank you so much for all that you've done for America, for all of your efforts to protect our democracy, and also just the work that you've done since leaving the Senate to really try to advance democracy and also protect human rights around the world, with your service, your international service as well. So thank you so much. Yes, pleasure. So let's get into it. This is the 15th anniversary of Citizens United. What do you think people need to know about that decision and where we are?
Well, first of all, just a small correction because it's important to the whole thing. That decision, Citizens United, did not strike down McCain-Feingold. It did something far worse. McCain-Feingold is still the law of the land. And so this is the way to understand it, as bizarre as it is. So John McCain and Russ Feingold come along, and we see a wall that says campaign finance reform. And it blocks the power of big money in politics. But we see that there's a brick missing. So we spend 8 years getting a brick and putting it in there. Okay, and you're right. This law was working. These political scientists and others that say it caused problems, it was working until the Supreme Court decided in a 5-4 terrible decision, Citizens United. They didn't go after McCain-Feingold, they went after the Tillman Act from 1907. Yes. And they took something that not even Mitch McConnell had questioned. For 100 years, all the time we were debating, nobody ever said, corporations should be able to spend whatever they want, there should be super PACs. So what they did was they basically gutted that and allowed corporations to play directly into campaign politics, which is what's going on. Because it still is not possible for people to give unlimited amounts of money to the Senate and House campaign committees. But they do it through all these other mechanisms. And as you know very well, Lisa, that it's a wink and a nod. They're not supposed to coordinate, but the real corrupting influence, as you know, is there's no penalties and there's no enforcement. And so the entire structure has been destroyed. Maybe not from a technical legal point of view in some ways, but overall, they destroyed it. And that's where you see the Elon Musk thing, which, this idea that he gave the president $250 million, we would have just said, what are you talking about? The most you could give was $2,000.
Yeah.
So it shows you that the entire edifice has been destroyed. And it's a terrible thing. And it has led to this era. It has led to things like Donald Trump, and it's led to the insanity that's going on now in every area. But it begins with the fact that there are essentially no effective campaign finance laws anymore.
Yeah, and thank you for that friendly correction, that friendly amendment, because as you point out, significant parts of McCain-Feingold are still the law of the land, but that loophole that they created, in essence, has swallowed the overall regulatory regime, and as you know, that regime puts strict limits on the amount of money that an individual could donate directly to a candidate or a committee, as you point out. And barred under that Tillman Act dating back to the Teddy Roosevelt administration, direct contributions from corporations. But now there's this so-called exception based on the Supreme Court's rewriting of the First Amendment to say that corporations can give unlimited amounts to these outside groups, and also individuals, billionaires, could give unlimited amounts without disclosure, with some limited ways in which the campaign finance law with Speech Now requires certain types of disclosures of donations for these super PACs, but no limits on how much money can go in. And so we have these $1 million gifts coming in. We have the Musk spending, the reported $250 million. We had separately, $20 million that we tallied, at least coming in from Elon Musk through different groups to try to influence the Wisconsin Supreme Court race. And the money for these billionaires is pennies on the dollar. It's like, I calculated at one point for one of the billionaires that because they were injecting like $10 million into a campaign, but they were a billionaire, it was the equivalent of an ordinary person buying a coffee and a bagel once a week. So it's just, so small for them. And yet, as you point out, this effort to close this sort of soft money, dark money loophole that was sort of growing before the McCain-Feingold Act was passed, that was such an effort to really tailor the campaign finance laws to address what was happening, which was that money was being spent by outside groups around the election without using the magic words of vote for or against, but the money was definitely being spent to influence the election. And so you were targeting money that was being spent right around the election. So it wasn't necessarily all year round. There were triggers for the timeframes for the disclosures, and the presumption was, and I think it was a very reasonable presumption, that if money was being spent saying, call that Senator so-and-so, for example, around an election period, that it was intended to influence that election. And so it warrant disclosure.
And in fact, that piece was struck down prior to Citizens United. You're right about that.
Yep.
These are what we call the phony issue ads.
Yes.
So there were two different sort of evils. One was the phony issue ads. The other was unlimited contributions being given to the campaign parties. That's the part that's still in place. But the thing that people forget about Citizens United, conveniently, is that as horrible as the decision was, and stupid really in many ways, there were two things that the court said had to happen. One was they said, well, of course, we assume that Congress will require disclosure.
Yeah.
Well, of course, Congress hasn't done anything of the kind. As soon as they had that decision, as soon as the Republicans took over in 2010, they just laughed at it. The second thing is they said, well, of course, you can't have coordination with the candidates. Well, you and I both know what goes on. So it doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or Republican majority leader. He goes out to, or minority leader, he goes out to some enormous casino hotel in Vegas, and he meets with Steve Wynn, let's say. And they just have an actual conversation about what's coming up in the Congress and how's their family. And then he leaves the room. A few minutes later, in walks the campaign people. Hey, how you doing, Steve? Can we have a $200 million, please? In other words, it's completely coordinated. It's completely fraudulent. It's completely corrupt, but it is not, the penalties are not adequate, and it's not enforced. And that is something that could be done, but that's kind of how it's done. It's a wink and a nod in a huge level.
It really is. And you see these sort of revolving doors of the candidate personnel. Then they roll revolving door out to lead the super PAC or the so-called independent expenditure committee. But, it is all a wink and a nod. And one of the things that I realized when I was researching this was that after the 1996 presidential election, when Senator Fred Thompson was leading one of the subcommittees, they held an investigation. As you were there, the Senate Judiciary Committee held an investigation into this dark. Yeah, and one of the things that was part of that investigation was that there were implications that Charles Koch had helped finance an operation called Triad in Kansas to try to sweep the Kansas delegation elections, to basically get Republicans in all those posts. And at the time, subsequently I heard from a staffer who was there at the time that Thompson refused to allow any subpoena to go to Koch to find out more about it. But a year after the committee hearings ended and the majority and minority reports were issued as part of that investigation, there was a whistleblower who said, yes, it was Koch money coming in. And that story, that was before the Kochs were really famous. That was before people really understood the role that Charles Koch was going to play and was playing, but was ultimately going to play in our elections in the past decade or so. Right. But that was a trial balloon. And that was part of the trial balloon that the McCain-Feingold Act, as part of this effort to close this, to put that brick in place, was attempting to address the way that money was coming around elections. And so I found it very interesting that way back then, before Charles Koch was more known, that he was involved in that activity, which was not illegal, which is why we need McCain, the full McCain-Feingold fix.
No, that's right. A lot of it's not illegal, certainly not anymore. And, there are things that can be done, but we're in such a terrible situation right now with a House and a Senate that I don't think would do these things, a Supreme Court that wouldn't probably do what it should do to overturn Citizens United, which it should, and a president who's completely hostile to campaign finance laws. So we got a mountain to climb, but it has to be done.
Yeah, we really do. Now, I have a book that's coming out soon. It's called Without Precedent, and it's about John Roberts and about the way he's changed the law. And as part of my research into that book before I wrote it, I was looking into the situation around that Citizens United decision. I just want to talk with you about it for a moment, Senator. I learned, sort of going back in time and piecing together the news trail, and Heidi Presbala ended up doing an investigation about this for Politico that was really illuminating. But it turned out that when so that case, as many of our watchers may not know, that case was argued twice before the Supreme Court. It had a second argument that was scheduled in September of 2009, basically to try to do what the court did, which was rewrite the law, expand this massive opportunity for corporations and CEOs to give money. But in September 2009, when the court held an out of season oral argument, shortly after that, what happened was that Jenny Thomas, the wife of Clarence Thomas, asked Cleta Mitchell, who also was not yet then famous, to create a nonprofit group, a 501c4 type group, to basically take advantage of the decision to come in Citizens United. And then it turns out that Jenny Thomas received a gift of $500,000 from a billionaire, soon to become famous, Harlan Crow, in December of 2009. So after that case was argued, as that case was pending decision, she gets a gift from the benefactor of her husband, Clarence Thomas, for $500,000. So on New Year's Eve, she races in an expedited request for an LLC approval in Virginia so she can deposit the check, right? And that group, Liberty Central, gets approved for corporate status in early January, just weeks, if not days, before the Citizens United decision comes out. So Clarence Thomas, in my personal opinion, should have recused himself from ruling on that case. He had a direct conflict with his wife's activities. It should have been a 4-4 decision, which would have upheld the law. He did not recuse himself, and he had the audacity to issue a concurring opinion attacking disclosure, preemptively attacking disclosure, saying that in his view, disclosure would be unconstitutional because it would chill the giving of money, when he certainly knew, there's no way his wife didn't tell him that Harlan Crow had just given her the seed money, $500,000 for her organization. So I consider that decision to be illegitimate at the time it was issued, an inappropriate overreach by the Supreme Court, by the Roberts Court, to rewrite our First Amendment in order to try to prevent Congress from regulating this. But then when Heidi Presbella documented this history, you could see that it was illegitimate in another way, because that decision never should have been issued with that type of conflict, with someone who had just received a gift federally of Justice Thomas.
We were getting a real head of steam on exposing all this kind of stuff before the Trump election. I was president until recently of the American Constitution Society. We and others were leading the charge to get subpoenas to some of these people, to investigate these failures to recuse themselves, all the stuff that was going on with these trips. And there was real momentum in both the House and the Senate, even bipartisan momentum, to create ethics rules for the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, both because the court feels unthreatened now and because everybody's completely distracted by 18,000 other things, nothing's happening on it. And yet you've just identified very eloquently the horrific, illegitimate stuff that went on to create a legal regime that is essentially the opposite of a legal regime. It is a chaos.
Yeah. So I agree with everything you said, Senator. I feel just great, I suppose, sorrow and grieving over how much momentum we had. We had a White House and a vice president and a presidential candidate who were publicly embracing reform of the court. This court, not just in that decision, but in decisions assailing the Voting Rights Act, weakening that, as you know well, decisions weakening our ability to have environmental laws and regulations deferred to by the courts. And obviously last year, the really anti-constitutional, counter-constitutional decision to give Donald Trump immunity from criminal prosecution, which paved the way for his return to the White House, emboldened. We, in my view, have a Supreme Court that is out of control, that is acting in a sort of like a judicial supremacist sort of way, rewriting our laws and restricting the ability of Congress to do the people's will. And the people's will in this area is on a bipartisan, transpartisan basis in favor of reform, of not having these billionaires have so much power, and also of reform of the Supreme Court and its lack of really serious, good, top-notch enforced ethics rules, which are clearly, not being enforced. And so actually the people are with us, but the capture of the Congress and the presidency right now has put a halt to the ability of us to move any legislation on that forward.
And that's, of course, what set the stage for this was the fact that the right stole the Supreme Court. They just simply stole it.
Yes.
When Scalia died, obviously Obama should have been able to pick the replacement. It was the longest time in American history that anyone was appointed and not acted on. It was like almost a year. The longest had been Louis Brandeis, which was only 132 days, which was long enough. And then, of course, the opposite. Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies, and people are already voting for the next president, and McConnell jams that through. That's literally the theft, and that creates the 6-3 majority on the right, and it has been horrible. I mean, even some of them are moderating a little bit of what Trump has done. A few things that are important, but overall, it's a license to destroy, and that's exactly what they're doing. And it could last for a very long time. But people have to remember that there are elections every 2 or 4 years, and there could be a new president in a few years. It could be somebody who's frankly sane and willing to restore American values and norms, and it is possible that the court could change, and that a lot of this horrible stuff could be reversed and should be reversed. But at the moment, very difficult.
Well, right. And if the court had not been stolen, those seats had not been stolen, as you described, Senator, it would be a 5-4 court in terms of Democratic appointees, and the Republican appointees would be in the minority. And they would not have been able to impose this most recent 4 years of radical decisions.
No, it's everything. And I'm like hundreds of lawsuits right now. I mean, thank God I had the opportunity at the American Constitution Society to help lead the charge to actually get more judges confirmed under Biden than under Trump. And
Yes.
these are the people that are at the lower court level, helping to stay or slow down or stop some of these outrages. But in the end, if it gets to the Supreme Court, it's much tougher. Sometimes we'll win. But that's the only real check we have right now on so much of this. And in the end, you got to do something about the Supreme Court or you're going to lose too many times.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this as we close out this wonderful interview. So overjoyed and joyful to have you on. What's giving you hope, Senator, or what inspires you to keep on with this fight? What can you share with us to help us be re-energized and keep moving forward?
Well, I want to be honest with you because you're my friend. It's not easy. I'm not going to pretend that this is, there's always tough times. And, there have been tough times before. You know what? That doesn't cover it. This is much worse. This is the biggest attack on our system of government since the Civil War. And yet, what gives me inspiration is the state we're both from, or at least much in my life, all my life. And that's Wisconsin. You see what's over my head here. It says vote progressive. That's not a new sign. That's from the 1930s. That's an original from the progressive era. So at a time when corporations were completely dominating our state, they called them the timbermen and the railroad men. Fighting Bob LaFollette rose up from a few miles from here in the town of Primrose and led a reform movement that connected with other reform movements across the country and helped do things like create the Sherman Antitrust Act, like create the FDA, like pass the Tillman Act to prevent corporation. It was his bill. So what gives me hope is that in the end, I think people will realize they're being taken for a ride, that these billionaires have the opposite of their interests in mind. And, progressives have to do a better job too. But in the end, fighting for fairness and some legitimate laws against corruption should be something that everybody is for. So it helps me get up in the morning, although, it's not always easy because the news is not very nice.
Yeah. Well, Senator, thank you for sharing that. That does give me hope too. And it's just a deep honor to have you on and to have had the chance to work with you. And I look forward to having you come on again and seeing all the things that we can do together to really bring forward that vision of fairness to help America to fulfill its promises. And thank you for your time today. And thank you to our watchers, our audience. Please subscribe, please share, please come back for more great interviews from heroes of American democracy, like my friend and beloved hero, Senator Russ Feingold.
We will continue to work together. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.